Welcome to this presentation called French Records on Your French Ancestors. This lecture was delivered on Wednesday the 28th of February 2018 at RootsTech in Salt Lake City. The first question that might occur to you is, what is a French ancestor? French-speaking people, indeed, are not necessarily French. Many of them live in France, though, but others live outside of France. In Wallonia, for instance, in Belgium, in Romandy, Switzerland, in the Aosta Valley, Italy, and elsewhere in the world. In fact, the French living in France exported their language all around the globe. The majority of French-speaking people live outside of France, outside of Europe. You can find them in eastern Canada, in the West Indies, in Western Africa, in Madagascar, in Polynesia, and so on. The second question that might occur to you is, what is France? In fact, it gained 1/3 of its territory in 1,000 years, as you may see on the two maps here. You can see the present-day situation in 2018 and what France was over 1,000 years ago in the year 1000. The people in the black part of the maps are French. Those in the green part were foreigners. The French territory expanded first at the expense of the Holy Empire. You can see on the maps here the situation in 1349 and then in 1483. But it expanded most in the long reign of King Louis XIV, the Sun King, from 1643 to 1715. Finally, it expanded at the expense of Italian states. You can see on the maps here the situation in 1768 and then in 1860 when France became what it is now. The territorial expansion of France, though, was more remarkable outside of Europe. The French territory expanded by creating two French colonial empires. The first one lasted from 1604 to 1763, when our good friends, the Brits, took most of it. The Second French Colonial Empire lasted from 1830 to 1962. So nowadays, France is composed of both its European kernel and several lands and islands overseas. France still possesses, indeed, remnants of its former two empires. Those remnants are not colonies anymore. They are now ordinary French counties or territories. The French still have, from the First French Colonial Empire, the islands of Saint-Pierre and Miquelon, the French West Indies, French Guiana, and the island of Reunion. And they still own, from the Second French Colonial Empire, French Polynesia, the island of Mayotte, New Caledonia, and the islands of Wallis and Futuna. Before the 20th century, the French practiced up to 4 different religions. The majority of them were Roman Catholics, though, and they lived everywhere in France. But there was, anyway, a minority of Calvinists living mostly in Normandy and in the south of France. They couldn't practice their faith from 1685 to 1787. There was a minority of Lutherans, too, living in the east of France. They were not French until 1648. And finally, there was a smaller minority of Jews. They became French citizens in 1791 and lived mostly in the cities of Colmar, Bordeaux, Bayonne, and Avignon. The various places where your first French ancestors settled in North America was determined by their faith. The Roman Catholics sailed to French colonies, namely Acadia, Canada, and Louisiana. The Calvinists, on the other hand, settled in British colonies like New England and Virginia, and in the Dutch colony called New Netherland. You may read articles about them on Wikipedia, like New France in North America, French Canadians, French Americans, French Cajuns in Louisiana, and French Huguenots in America. Let me give you 3 examples of French Huguenots who settled on the East Coast in North America in the 17th century. In 1621, a man called Philippe de Lannoy settled in New England. He's one of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's ancestors. In 1624, another man called Georges Rappaille settled in New Netherland. He became one of Humphrey Bogart's ancestors. And finally, in 1620, a third man called Nicolas Marteau settled in Virginia. He became one of George Washington's ancestors. Information about your French ancestors can be found in France in the French public archives. We call them Archives de France, which means, of course, Archives of France. The French public archives are run by three different ministries: the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of the Armies, and the Ministry of Culture. The latter ministry is in charge, in fact, of four different types of archives: the National Archives, the Overseas Archives, the County Archives, and the Municipal Archives. Let's start with the French Municipal Archives. They are run by the Ministry of Culture and various city councils. Nowadays, there are up to 36,784 municipalities in France, namely 36,568 in Europe and 216 overseas. You may find a list of all those French municipalities on Infoline, Wikipedia, or France Gen Web. Out of all those municipalities, about 610 only keep a repository of municipal archives, namely 590 in Europe and 18 overseas. Finally, out of all those 610 repositories, only 40 put their archives online. One of the French municipal archives needs a special comment. Paris archives burnt indeed in 1870. All the records previous to 1860 had to be collected again by asking the Parisians to deliver their personal civil records. You have now old records concerning 12 former city districts from 1792 to 1859, namely births, marriages, and deaths. And you have new records concerning the current 20 city districts in Paris, namely births from 1860 to 1912, marriages from 1860 to 1940, and deaths from 1860 to 1986. Let's talk about now the French county archives. They are run by the Ministry of Culture and county councils. 96 of them can be found in Europe, that is 94 on the mainland and 2 in Corsica, and 13 of them overseas, that is 5 in overseas counties and 8 in overseas territories. You may find a comprehensive list of county archives in France on various websites, namely on France Archives, on GenealoWiki, and on Guide de Généalogie, which means Guide of Genealogy. The records in French county archives are kept in various series. The online records can be found in Series E with vital and notarial records, Series R with army records, and Series M, censuses. The paper records are divided into 4 categories: old records before 1790, new records from 1790 to 1939, recent records after 1939, and timeless records. The major records which are very useful for genealogy in the French county archives are, first of all, civil registers. You have to go to the French repositories in France to read those from 1906 to 1932. But those from 1793 to 1905 can be viewed online. Then you have the church books, most of them Roman Catholic ones, which are all online now. You have 2 copies of the same books from 1737 to 1792, namely the municipal copy and the county copy. Before that, from 1668 to 1736, you may have 2 copies. In those copies, all the baptism, marriage, and burial records have been written down in the same books. Before 1668, there is only 1 copy of the books, and all the baptism, marriage, and burial records have been written down in 3 different books. And finally, you have the notarial records, in which you can find marriage contracts and post-mortem inventories, which bring much information about your ancestors' everyday life in France. Now, let's speak about the Metropolitan National Archives in France, run by the French Ministry of Culture. Their records are kept now in 2 repositories. First of all, in Paris, for old public records produced before 1790, and then Pierre Le Clercq for new public records produced after 1789. The repository in Fontainebleau has been closed recently. So far, the only online records you can view at home are those you can find in the Leonore database, consisting in 390,000 files about members of the French Legion of Honor. Other French public records are kept at the Overseas National Archives in France, still run by the French Ministry of Culture. They contain data about the first French colonization from 1604 to 1763 concerning Acadia, Canada, Louisiana, the West Indies, Guyana, Senegal, Reunion, Mauritius, and India. They contain, too, data about the second French colonization from 1830 to 1962 concerning this time Africa, New Caledonia, Syria, Lebanon, French Polynesia, Indochina, and Wallis and Futuna. The French Overseas National Archives are kept in only one repository in Aix-en-Provence in the south of France. We call it ANAM for Archives Nationales d'Outre-mer. It keeps records about former French colonies. There is a database where you can view some of the overseas records. It is called IREL. You will find in it former colonial vital records, colonial military enlistment books, and files about French convicts sent overseas. Let me have a word now about the French Diplomatic National Archives run by the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The diplomatic records are kept in two main repositories in France. First of all, in La Courneuve near Paris for all the documents produced in France, and then in Nantes in Brittany for other documents produced abroad. In the ADL database, which means Archives diplomatiques en ligne or online diplomatic archives, you can view French consular registers, files about French diplomats, and documents on some foreigners. The last public archives I will talk about now are the Military National Archives run by the French Ministry of Defense, called Ministry of the Armies too. There is one repository in Vincennes, near Paris, for all the documents concerning infantry and the French Air Force. All the documents concerning the French Navy are kept in the French ports of Cherbourg, Brest, Lorient, Rochefort, and Toulon. The major database concerning infantry and the French Air Force is called Mémoire des Hommes, which means men's memory. You can view in it documents about the First World War, like soldiers who died for France, soldiers who were executed, or Air Force pilots and staff. You can view too documents about the Second World War and 3 other wars in Indochina, Korea, and Algeria. I've been speaking about public archives so far, but I would like to end my presentation with a few words about the French National Public Library. It was founded by King Francis I on the 28th of December 1537 with the creation of the legal deposit in France. It contains up to 40 million printed documents and 250,000 manuscripts. In its huge database called Gallica, you can view up to 3.5 million digitized documents, books about various families, books about French heraldry, national and local periodicals, and many other printed jewels. Last but not least, there is one library in France which can be very useful for genealogists whose French ancestors were Calvinists or Lutherans. It is a French private library in Paris run by the Société de l'Histoire du Protestantisme Français, which means Historical Society on French Protestantism. This library, called Bibliothèque du Protestantisme Français, or BPF, shelters many printed books from up to the 16th century, as well as periodicals. It shelters too manuscripts like private letters and Protestant church books. Well, this is the end for now. My next presentation will be about your French ancestors' free public records online. So, thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much for your applause. Is there any question? I suppose not. So, cheerio!